Well, what's up again there, guys? Brian here, the Three Topics Gamer, here to give you another episode of my worst to best series. This time I'll be tackling the PlayStation exclusive shooter franchise Killzone, giving you my ranking of the 6 primary entries in the franchise. Now, before I get into my ranking, I would really appreciate it if you haven't already to give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to press that subscribe button to help grow the channel, and also make sure you press that notifications bell button so that you are notified the moment I upload another video. And don't forget to press also the links in the description below so you can follow me on all my social media outlets. So with that out of the way, let's jump right into the first 6th place and worst installment in the Killzone franchise, and it just so happens to be... Ranked lowest on my list goes to Killzone Liberation on the PlayStation Portable. Now, like other first-person shooter franchises, when it comes to converting itself to the PlayStation Portable, there are a number of limitations that a developer would have to work with in order to try to get the best game that they can with what they're left to work with. And overall, I just didn't feel that Killzone Liberation lived up to be a sequel to a somewhat middle-of-the-road game like the first Killzone game was, or serve as a good game in order to lead up to its follow-up Killzone II. The story takes place 2 months after the events of the first Killzone, and you play as Jan Templar as he goes on several operations in order to fight off the last concentrated groups of Helgun forces on Vecta, while the ISA forces prepare for the invasion of Helgun for Killzone II. When it comes to the plot details, this game has hardly any good amounts of it, and what does happen in this game is just poorly executed and just does not really do a good job leading up to its follow-up events. Now, obviously, without a secondary joystick, Killzone Liberation probably wouldn't be able to handle a first-person shooter gameplay style, so instead they settled for using a top-down isometric view, which relies on old-school tank controls, which makes the game very slow and hard to maneuver at times. In my opinion, they really would have been better off trying a third-person over-the-shoulder shooter, or if they wanted to, they could have just made this a side-scrolling shooter like games like Contra, Mega Man, or Metal Slug. With a combination of an underwhelming set of graphics, slow controls, and a non-impressive campaign, this is the one entry on this list that even I, as a big fan of the franchise, could not recommend. Next on my list, unfortunately, has to go to the very first Killzone from 2004. Now, at the time of this game's release, it was always, in my opinion, that Killzone was to serve as PlayStation's answer to Microsoft's Halo franchise. But while I do believe that there would be an eventual installment that could live up to those standards, the first entry was very unsuccessful. Now, the story for the entire Killzone franchise could be summarized to you basically fighting off an entire race of space Nazis, and the similarities between Nazi Germany and the Helghast are very obvious. But for the first installment, it centers around a 4-man squad needing to do all it can to fight off the initial invasion force of Helghast, trying to take over the planet of Vecta and reaching the planet's orbital defense station in order to deal with a traitor amongst the ISA forces before the Earth fleet arrives and can be completely destroyed. Now, I actually think that how the story plays out is quite good, and it is helped along by some excellent performances from the voice actors, and for 2004, the graphics are actually quite good. My biggest problem is that it simply has some really bad controls, and during my playthrough, I experienced several technical issues, and the overall feel of the combat just felt too sluggish, which meant that it was a real grind for me to kind of force my way to get through this game, and at times it got very frustrating. It's also a bit disappointing that despite having the option to play as 4 different characters, they don't really feel very different from each other. Despite its flaws, I don't see the first Killzone as a bad game, as this did serve as one of Guerrilla Games' first games that they ever developed, and they would use this as a template in order to learn from this experience and create better games, and that is certainly something that I think they definitely did succeed in doing. Ranked 4th on my list goes to Killzone Mercenary on the PlayStation Vita. Running on the same graphics engine as Killzone III, it is very much possible that Killzone Mercenary is the best looking first-person shooter game on the Vita, though it's not entirely perfect from start to finish. While the game's plot is very uninteresting and the campaign is extremely short, lasting only about 5 hours, and on top of that, the actual characters that you'll be playing as are not very interesting and go through no amount of significant character development, what is interesting is the concept. With this game taking place between the events of Killzones 2 and 3, as a mercenary, you will find yourself fighting for both the ISA and the Helghast, giving you a chance to see both perspectives of the war, which no game in this series allows you to do. Where the game really shines is in its gameplay and taking advantage of the PlayStation Vita's improvements over the PlayStation Portable. As a shooter, Killzone Mercenary feels excellent with its gameplay, feeling much less linear to its console counterparts and moving at a much faster pace, similar to something like Doom or Wolfenstein, and with the use of the touchscreen to initiate melee attacks, it feels very satisfying. The maps and locations are very well structured, taking place between the planets of Vecta and Helghast, and the multiplayer here is also pretty fun to experience, but I'm sure some of you won't really get a chance to experience that in 2019. However, overall, if you still own a PlayStation Vita and have some interest in growing your library, then Killzone Mercenary would be a good addition to your collection. Ranked third on my list just so happens to go to Killzone III. For me, Killzone 3 is well above average, however, it did seem to disappoint in one department of gaming that I care about the most, which is its story. The plot of this game takes place immediately after the ending of Killzone 2, and the Helghast forces are now on an all-out attack mode, and the majority of the ISA forces have retreated, leaving a small force of troops left on the planet of Helghast. After months and months of holding out for hopes that the ISA reinforcements would return, they realize that they must escape the planet before the last of their small unit of troops is wiped out. While the campaign is certainly compelling on the ISA side, I can't say the same thing about the Helghast forces, as the majority of their scenes are focused on a major division amongst the Helghast higher-ups that sees them fighting more against each other than they do against the enemy, and this never seems to change from start to finish. What does allow Killzone 3 to stand out is in its improvements of its gameplay over its previous installment and the sheer amount of action set pieces that are some of the most impressive that you will experience throughout the entire Killzone franchise. The weapon and vehicle variety has also been greatly improved upon, granting you far more options at your disposal when it comes to fighting off the Helghast. The multiplayer was also just as fun here as it was in Killzone 2, and coming from someone who really wasn't that into multiplayer, this was one of the few exceptions. However, despite its flaws in the story department, it definitely did exceed in terms of quality and enjoyment, granting it its number 3 spot on my list. Number 2 on my list goes to the very first game I ever played on the PlayStation 4, which was Killzone Shadowfall. As one of the exclusive release titles for the system, Shadowfall always served in my eyes as an example of what the PlayStation 4 was capable of, and as an example of what things were to come in the days and years that would follow. In terms of plot, Shadowfall takes place 30 years after the events of Killzone 3, and it really changed the entire tone of the franchise by, instead of focusing on an all-out war, it instead introduced a different scenario that had the Helghast being forced to live on the planet Vecta alongside the ISA, and now separated by a wall, tensions would begin to rise between the two factions that would instantly cause a new conflict to break out. In terms of overall visuals, it's obvious that Shadowfall is the best looking game in the series. Though this serves as the last official entry in the series, the gameplay style had been significantly modified. This time around, the maps are much more open-ended, recommending you to take a much more stealth approach, and as in every single mission, there is a much wider open map which, instead of forcing you down linear paths as older games did, it actually encourages you to experiment on multiple paths that can actually give you much more options, thereby granting every new map and every new level a new higher quality of replayability that was never really present in any of the previous installments. One of the best additions that Shadowfall has is the addition of your Owl, which serves as an advanced hover attack drone that has multiple functions that can aid you in combat. The multiplayer this time around also includes a new customizable system which allows you to add different perks and different techniques to all of the 3 different primary combat classes of Assault, Scout, and Support, which encourages you to experiment to see which loadout and playstyle you would prefer. With all these improvements, Killzone Shadowfall serves as a great final installment to a long-running franchise. Ranked number 1 in my favorite Killzone game of all time was undoubtedly going to be Killzone II. What makes Killzone 2 stand apart from every other installment on my list is that it is the only installment that literally improved upon every single aspect and every single department of the previous installments. While games like Killzone III and Shadowfall certainly did improve in specific departments that Killzone II had, it lost in quality in other departments. That did not happen here because at the very moment that Guerrilla Studios showed us that very impressive Killzone II trailer all the way back at E3 2005, the hype for this game was insane. And unlike so many games in history that have failed to live up to such levels of hype, Killzone 2 delivered with flying colors, so much so that even to this day it is considered to be one of the greatest sequels that the PlayStation 3 generation ever produced. The story is really at its most intense here, as you will be taking the fight to the Helghast home planet of Helgon as you take part in what I consider to be the D-Day of galactic space invasions. I believe that the characters are much more battle-handed here than they did in any other installment. The gameplay was not nearly as frustrating to deal with, as your character's movements were being much more grounded and the gameplay had a sense of weight, and the cover system was extremely useful in many of the much more extremely tough firefights that you will encounter. The voice acting performances across the board were amazing, and the visuals, level variety, and atmosphere really illustrated just how much death and destruction you were constantly surrounded by from beginning to end. Killzone 2 also started the multiplayer buzz that would be continued in Killzones 3 and Shadowfall. And as someone who really isn't all that into multiplayer, this was the one major exception that made multiplayer an addiction for me at a time. Killzone 2 was also one of the greatest examples of what kind of quality of games you could only get on a PlayStation console. And from the moment that this game was released all the way back in 2009 to many years later, to even now a full decade later, Killzone 2 will always remain one of my favorite PlayStation exclusive titles that ever came out on my favorite PlayStation console of all time. And that'll do it for my ranking of the 6 installments in the Killzone franchise. So now that you guys know my list of how I would rank these games, for those of you that have actually played all of these games or just a good number of them, how would you rank the Killzone games from worst to best in your particular order? Share your list with me and everyone else in the comments down below. And like always, I want to thank all of you guys for watching. You're awesome. Don't forget to share this video to help spread the word. And like always, I will see you next time.